Welcome to class 24 on trust and good faith, which is the first class in the final section of this course on in-group epistemic distortion and bad faith actors. The last section was about reasoning with sources, mostly reasoning when to trust arguments from authority. At the end of that section, we started talking about the way group dynamics can sometimes poison people against legitimate authorities. For instance, the way that the dynamics of anti-vax groups can poison people against taking sound medical advice from public health officials. And we looked at Helene de Cruz on how holding unusual beliefs can function as a good way to signal group membership, and Thi Nguyen on how cult-like leaders can use evidential preemption to block in-group members from trusting outsiders. This last tactic gets us specifically to the issue of bad faith actors. All along, we've been looking at ways that people can be systematically irrational. For instance, talking about cognitive biases. All of these quirks in the way humans think can be exploited by people who are just trying to advance their own selfish ends. In this class, I want to drill down on just how people like that are acting badly. And all of this will be summarized under the headings bad faith and good faith. In this case, the reading we had doesn't actually mention bad faith or good faith directly. We read more of Maureen Linker's book on intellectual empathy. This ties back, though, to good faith because we will see that practicing intellectual empathy is a necessary condition when it on acting in good faith when it comes to group critical thinking. So it's important to get a complete picture of what intellectual empathy is on Linker's view. All right, so let's talk about good faith itself. Originally, this was a legal term. And it's specifically from contract law. So if you are acting in good faith, you are doing your best to hold up your end of an agreement. So if you sign a contract and you agree to, say, put a roof on someone's house, you do the best job you can in putting on the roof. And maybe there were some problems with a supplier, things that were out of your control went wrong. But if you did the best you can, you were trying to fulfill the contract in good faith. We also talk about negotiating in good faith. When you are making an agreement to begin with, you are supposed to be open and honest when making that agreement, right? If you're selling something, you disclose everything that might be wrong with it. You don't hide the fact that the car is actually going to blow up or something. I don't know. Another one is good faith reporting. You are said to do in the law. You are said to engage in good faith reporting if the statements that you report to the court or to a regulator are things that you believe are true. A good faith estimate, right, is an honest estimate about how much you think something will wind up costing. So again, if you're hired to put a roof on a house, you make an estimate about how much it's going to cost. If you do that in good faith, that just means that you really think that this is how much it's going to cost. You're not planning on springing any extra hidden fees on people. The thing to notice about all of these situations, all of these different examples of good faith in a legal sense, is that the focus is on intent and not outcome. Being a good faith actor just means that you are doing your best to follow the law, to follow the basic rules for the kinds of transactions that you are engaged in. So here's a passage from Black's Law Dictionary. This is actually an older edition. But Black's Law Dictionary is not a legal document, but it's a common reference tool for lawyers. Good faith is honesty of intention, an honest intention to abstain from taking unconscientious advantage of another, even through technicalities of the law, together with an absence of all information, notice, or benefit or belief of facts that would render a transaction unconscientious. So, acting honestly. And then bad faith is just the opposite of good faith. So bad faith will generally involve some intent to deceive or some kind of fraud, right? So already we can see that this legal notion of good faith and bad faith has direct applications to critical thinking, in especially critical thinking in a group context. Sometimes in this class, I ask students early in the semester to write their own rules for respectful conversation about controversial issues. And I've been consistently impressed with the breadth and depth of the ideas people suggest. So here's a sampling of things people have suggested in the past. There were rules that promote logical structure. For instance, you should build on other people's thoughts and on examples, back up your ideas with evidence. There were rules banning abusive behavior, criticize ideas, not the person. Rules that promote mutual understanding, be open-minded at all times. Rules about off-limit topics. So this was interesting. A lot of people just said flat out, no topic is off-limit. And I pushed back on that a little because sometimes merely broaching topics can alienate people from a conversation. If the topic, for instance, is about that person's right to be there or exist, right? So this comes up in, for instance, conversations about gender identity. You might just want to say off the bat, don't question other people's gender identity. And when I made that pushback, people were like, well, if you're uncomfortable with a topic, you should at least explain why. And I thought that was fair. There were rules about tone and nonverbal communication. Don't yell for the in-person class. So we have this notion of good faith from the law that says you're doing your best to follow an agreement. Our conversations, when we think critically together, also contain agreements. And these are agreements that are generally implicit, but in this case, we made them explicit. So we can begin to define a notion of good faith for the purpose of critical thinking. This is what I came up with. The person reasons together with someone else in good faith if they're making an honest attempt to find the truth, if they follow the rules for conversation, both implicit and explicit, and if they practice intellectual empathy. So we've got 3 sub-items here, but the basic idea is still one essentially about intent. You are doing your best to be a critical thinker, relate to the other person as another critical thinker, and of course, your underlying intent is to understand the truth. One of my assumptions is that epistemic norms, rules for how we go about learning and discovering things, have a certain degree of independence, and you've just got to get having the facts right as one of your basic goals when you're a critical thinker. This gets back to what in the first class we referred to as the epistemic model of critical thinking from Bob Ennis, where getting it right, just understanding some truth, is a fundamental goal of critical thinking. So a lot of what's going to happen now is we're going to look at what the kinds of tactics that people engage in when they're not actually operating in good faith. Some of these we already talked about when we talked about in-group epistemic distortion. As a prelude to some of the other aspects of bad faith conversation, I want to read this quote from Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre was a philosopher who, among other things, lived through the Nazi occupation of Paris. And after the defeat of the Nazis, he wrote a book called Anti-Semite and Jew, which is not actually a good book because he doesn't really understand Judaism. He didn't really know any Jewish people. But after having lived through the Nazi occupation of Paris, he had some pretty damn good insights into the way that Nazis operate. So this is a quote from that book. Never believe that anti-Semites are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know that their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. I like that. I mean, I feel like part of teaching critical thinking is actually teaching respect for words, believe in words. The anti-Semites, Sartre continues, have a right to play. They even like to play with discourse, for by giving ridiculous reasons, they discredit the seriousness of their interlocutors. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound judgment, but to intimidate and disconcert. So I actually use this quote sometimes in online conversations when I feel like someone is acting in bad faith and someone's being a troll, for instance, and you just want to warn people against engaging with the trolls. They're not trying to reason with you. They are teasing you. They are mocking you by pretending to engage in argument, but not really doing so. And we'll talk about some terms for these tactics in going forward in the next few classes. Okay, so for the exercise for this class, I asked you to describe a time when you were talking with someone and you realized that they were not operating in good faith. And in general, how do you tell if someone is not operating in good faith? And so in the in-person class, we did that exercise right here in the middle. If you're watching this video online, you probably already did it. I got some really good answers here. I feel like people do have a good intuitive sense of when how to recognize someone is not operating in good faith. And I think the goal here as a critical thinker is just to sharpen our existing intuitions about when to engage and when to disengage. Okay, so I said that one aspect of being operating in good faith is practicing intellectual empathy. So let's return to the discussion of intellectual empathy. This is the term from Maureen Linker. With this first part's just review. I use the term intellectual empathy for the work we will be doing in this book because it covers the cognitive affective elements of thinking about identity and social difference. So recall that Linker is writing a critical thinking book for people who are engaged across political or social divides, for instance, and talking about sensitive topics like race or gender. And she encourages empathy. And the thing that I like about it is that her notion of intellectual empathy is both cognitive and affective. Affective meaning relating to emotion, cognitive meaning relating to reason, right? And she combines these nicely. So this is the definition that we are working with. Intellectual empathy is the ability to holistically understand the perspective of the person you are reasoning with. And I pulled together a bunch of elements here from both from Linker and from a more traditional scholar of critical thinking, Richard Paul. So intellectual empathy requires charitably reconstructing someone's reasons for belief and being able to reason from premises you don't agree with. That's the intellectual side of intellectual empathy. That was getting that from Richard Paul. It also requires understanding how their beliefs are situated in their web of belief and understanding their emotional motivations for their belief. That's the more affective side that I'm getting from Linker. So, this is the parts from Linker and Paul, but we can skip over that. Just more review. Linker establishes several elements of intellectual empathy. And one of the things that we'd already talked about was the idea that identity is intersectional. And intersectionality was raised as a cure for what Linker called diversity fatigue. I'm going to review intersectionality because I think it's a very important topic, and a lot of people don't encounter it in college. So intersectionality. Intersectionality is the way different social identities and the power imbalances between them interact in different contexts. So we were talking about critical thinking about race and gender, for instance. And the important thing is that we all have multiple identities, social identities, and those interact in different ways. So, for instance, the experience of being a Black woman is shaped by two identities, being Black and being a woman. The people who initially developed the theory of intersectionality were Black women in the 70s and 80s who were frustrated both by the way that they were treated by white women in the feminist movement and by Black men in the civil rights movement. They felt like that the intersection of those identities wasn't being properly respected. Um, but the term itself is more general and more and purely descriptive. It's just a simple fact. We all have multiple social identities. We are Black, we are white, we are men, we are women, we are non-binary, we are biracial, we are uh, we are disabled, we are temporarily fully bodied, all sorts of things, and all of these intersect. And the important lesson here is that um, these intersections can interact in unexpected ways. So they don't form a simple hierarchy. You don't say, "Oh, I have two marginalized identities and therefore I'm doubly oppressed." Often you can say that, but not always. The intersectionality is not additive. It functions in all sorts of ways. So let me just give you two quick examples of this, and this is still review, but it's important. We live in a patriarchal society, and in general, being male has advantages over being female. But when a Black identity intersects with masculinity, and that in turn comes in the context of interaction with the police, being male becomes a disadvantage because the prejudice against Black men that says that they are criminal um, suddenly means that you are a target. Um, so uh, whether or not being male is a advantage in our society is contextual, and that context changes with the intersectionality, what other identities it intersects with, and with who you're interacting with. And again, I think events of the past, well, actually, the 100 years, but certainly recently, have shown amply that Black men are at a disadvantage when interacting with the police. Here's another one that you don't hear as much, but I think it's important. Ordinarily, the elderly are a vulnerable population. If you're old, that generally means that you're at a disadvantage. You're probably disabled. You're not as able to function in society. But if you combine being elderly with being wealthy, suddenly you're looking at the most powerful people in the world. All right. So intersectionality was a crucial element in intellectual empathy. when you interact with someone and try and reason cooperatively with them, you need to understand all of their identities and how they intersect. You also need to understand your own identities and how they intersect. So intersectionality is, as I've been emphasizing, is not simply additive, although it often is. It's contextual. An advantage may become a disadvantage in some contexts. Also, it's not just about marginalized identities. Whiteness and masculinity have intersectionality too, and understanding the intersection of your identities helps you understand the intersection of someone else's identities, right? This is the bit that Linker says when she talks about how self-knowledge and knowledge of others are mutually reinforcing. Okay. And all of this comes down to a lesson from Audre Lorde. There can be no hierarchies of oppression. No one gets to win the oppression Olympics. So now I want to move on to the bit of the reading that we did for today. In talking about in dealing with people whose political or social orientation is radically different than your own, Linker has some advice for creating intellectual empathy. And some of this is what she calls the Uncle Mo analogy. So she starts by, she says she in her class, she asks how many people have a relative whose political beliefs would be embarrassing to if the class heard about them, and everyone raises their hand. No matter where they're from, you've got someone in your family who is biased against someone else from some other family that you might be interacting with in class. So Linker's advice: treat those who express social beliefs that you find uncomfortable, false, or morally problematic like you would treat your Uncle Mo, who makes you roll your eyes, but with whom you nevertheless have to live. The idea is that you have to, most people feel obligated to stay with their families. You're not entirely, and certainly people do break off from their families. But if you're sticking with your family, you know what it means to stick with someone whose ideas you find morally problematic. But just as we should begin with the assumption that people are reasonable, we should also begin with the presumption that people are trustworthy and that they have and that we do have an obligation to understand and make sense of their seemingly biased or stereotypical claims. This is not a recommendation that comes from being nice or because it will magically lead to us all getting along. That's important. No one pretends that we're going to get along easily. Rather, the point of view of it, from the point of view of intellectual empathy, we should assume these things because it puts us in a better position for gathering and sharing evidence. I want to emphasize that again. Although we're talking about political issues here, ultimately, the concerns of this class are epistemic. They're about knowledge, gathering knowledge, learning. And in fact, when you interact with people, no matter who they are, you can learn from them. And part of operating in good faith means being willing to learn from other people. And they have the mirror obligation. You should hope that they're willing to learn from you. All right. So there are actually 5 elements of intellectual empathy for Linker. We talked about intersectionality. We're actually skipping over the invisibility of privilege and cooperative reasoning. We've kind of talked about those in other ways, though. So the last 2 things I want to talk about in this class are conditional trust and a mutual vulnerability. So these are the remaining elements of intellectual empathy. So engaging with someone in good faith means putting trust in them. That trust has to be conditional, though, because we know that there are bad faith actors out there. So what does it mean to trust someone in this context? These are Linker's ideas. You must be willing to consider relevant counter evidence to a claim, if someone is willing to present it. We must remain open to the person's relevant supporting evidence, even if we don't like what it means, or even if we're wrong about the person being biased. That is, so she's thinking here specifically about situations where someone might do something, then you call them out for maybe being racist, right? And we need to understand their reasons if we're operating in good faith. And again, if someone admits that they were being thoughtless or being humorous, or makes an excuse for why they said something that might be problematic, Linker suggests that you need to be willing to let them withdraw that. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't really mean to say that. I'm sorry. Again, being able to accept apologies is a condition for continued engagement. I mean, you don't have to accept apologies. You don't have to accept that someone, when they said they were only joking, didn't know how hurtful they were being. But if you do that, you're disengaging with them, and that means you should disengage. If you engage, you have to accept the apology. And finally, the person reassures us that he or she will not distrust us in the future for raising the possibility that his or her claim was biased. That is, you call someone out, you need to accept their apology, and they need to accept that you are willing to call them out. Mutual vulnerability. This is a tricky one. But basically, if we are to actually learn from each other, we need to open ourselves up to topics that might be difficult. And this relationship has to be reciprocal. And again, if someone is acting in bad faith, they will take advantage of it. If they are acting in good faith, they won't. And so you need to continue to engage with the people who are acting in good faith and willing to be vulnerable with you. So this is Linker's final quote. The fifth and final skill for intellectual empathy is the recognition of mutual vulnerability. To be clear, vulnerability as it relates to the skill is not meant as a position of weakness or defenselessness. Rather, vulnerability as a skill of intellectual empathy is a willingness to be open to self-correction and transformation. You've got to be willing to put yourself out there, and you've got to be willing to change. All right, so that's good faith. Good faith means good intent. It means operating with intellectual empathy. It means making an honest effort to find the truth and follow the rules for conversation. So for the next class, we're going to look at the kinds of situations that can be created and exploited by people who are not operating in good faith. We're going to look at in-group epistemic distortion.